Hi everyone, I thought we will be focusing on how much water to use on your watercolor paper and just a quick preview of my garden. It is all so beautiful now that it's autumn. So when I started painting in watercolor, the most difficult thing for me was the amount of water to use on watercolor paper. So I decided to make a quick video for my beginners. There are loads of books out there. In the end, it is what you want to use, how much water you prefer on your paper, and also to practice. It's what you experience with your paper and your water. No one can tell you. You have to literally sit there with your watercolor paper, with a brush, with water, with paint, and play around. These are little fun projects that you can do when you don't have a lot of time to paint. But this is the only way, if you do it yourself, to practice the amount of water that you need on your paper. Now, some artists prefer to paint wet on wet, some prefer to paint wet on dry, some prefer both. So it's all up to you, it's what you prefer. So in this section, I deliberately added a load of water and I dropped in some of the core watercolors, and you will notice that the pigment just stays there in the middle where I dropped it. It doesn't flow anywhere, it just stays there. So the water will take longer to evaporate because it is so wet, and it is summer here at the moment, so in winter water takes even longer to evaporate on the paper. So this should take quite quickly, but you will notice how long it takes even in summer for the water to evaporate. The second one, I used a little less water. Now I just want to show you how much water there still is. I'm going to move some of the pigment around with my brush just to show you how much pigment I dropped in and how much water ratio there is. The second one, a little bit less water, but still quite a lot of water. So there's little puddles of water, if you can see. But just look how beautiful this pigment flows into this water that I dropped down. So with a little less water, the pigment immediately flows. And it creates this beautiful shape in the water. But it is still too wet. From the top, you will see it is still sopping wet, number one. Number two, it's a little less, but there are still puddles. The water still stays where there's most puddles. So all the pigment stays there. And when it dries, it will create either cauliflowers or it will create these runbacks and weird markings, which sometimes you don't want in watercolor. Number three, I will use a little less water. But you can see there's still a little bit too much water. Again, the pigment flows beautifully in this section of the water where I dropped. So whenever you wet the paper, wherever you wet the paper in watercolor, the pigment will flow. And you will see how it stops right there on the edge where the water stopped. And that will create a very hard water marking or water line. Number two, still a lot of water. You can see the puddles. Number three, a few puddles, but it was drier than the first two. And all of those little shapes on the edges where the water stops will create markings when it dry, weird markings. Now on number four, I'm going to try my best to create the perfect sheen on the paper. Now, you want to, when you lift the paper, you just want to see a beautiful sheen. You don't want to see any puddles like the first three. You want to see a beautiful, soft sheen on the paper. Now there's still a little bit of puddles, but you will see they will all disappear. I will remove it. I will dab my brush on the tissue paper just to remove most of the water, and that is the perfect sheen that you want on your paper. So if you lift your paper up, you will see that sheen on the paper, and that is what you want. And again, everyone is different. Some people prefer puddles of water, some prefer a lot more water, but this is what I want for my paper when I paint, and I want to paint wet and wet, especially on flowers or fruit and veggies or whatever you paint. That is what I prefer. So let's start from number 1 to 4 again. Number 1 is still very wet, loads of puddles. 2, you can see the puddles. 3, it's a little bit drier, but you can see all of those little markings. And number 4, this is what you should aim for. Now this is the one that I always aim for, the number 4, and for me that is what I find works for me in my type of watercolor painting. Now just to recap, this is how they dried in the end. Number 1, look at all the little markings, the cauliflower markings. Number 2, same, because the water was staying there for a longer period. Number 3, which I used a little bit less water. Paint, and that is number 4. You can see there's not a lot of markings. Obviously if I now use the brush and move the pigment around, all of those little markings around the edges would have been much softer, but because I only wet that certain section, there will be hard lines. But number 4 is the perfect ratio of water on paper that you should aim for. If that is what you prefer, that is what I prefer. And I hope this made a lot of sense, and it will help you with your watercolor journey, especially if you're a beginner, because that is exactly what most of us battle with. The only way we succeed in watercolor is if you practice. So whenever you feel like painting but you don't know what to paint and you just want to practice, get out your paper, water, brushes and pigment and play around and see which water ratio you prefer on your paper. I hope this helped you, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see some more of these videos.